Welcome to Unrestrained, the podcast series from CPI. Here you can enjoy conversations where professionals on all sides of crisis and behavior management relax and open up about themselves, their workplace, and their clients. You'll get the latest tips and trends from the best in the business, so tune in often to integrate their experiences with your own. Hello and welcome to Unrestrained, the CPI podcast series. This is your host, Terry Vittone. This month's episode of Unrestrained is unique in the history of the series. Rather than presenting a one-on-one interview with an expert in crisis or behavior management, it instead tells the backstory and includes several examples of De-Escalation Tales, a series of informative, convenient short stories, 5 minutes or less, told by CPI Certified Instructors about their real-life experiences successfully de-escalating challenging, disruptive, or dangerous behaviors in their workplaces. Along with the examples included in the podcast, this series of audio recordings is presented in CPI's Yammer instructor community, a platform available to all CPI certified instructors. To learn how to access the community, see the How to Access the Yammer instructor community section of the article accompanying this recording. In early 2014, I was new to CPI and tasked with producing copy and content relevant to our training. One of my first initiatives was to conduct an interview with architect Amy Schaineman, the Director of Design Development for PDC Midwest, a Wisconsin-based architect-led design-build firm that specializes in senior living. Amy granted us an informative and inspiring interview about how physical environments are critical components of successful memory care programs. The interview, relevant to our dementia care specialist offering, is available in print only. You can find it by typing PDC Midwest in the search bar of the blog section of CPI's website. Because of the interest generated by Amy's interview, our internet marketing manager suggested CPI begin a podcast series, and Unrestrained was born. Soon after, I was given the opportunity to take the 4-day instructor certification program option of CPI's Nonviolent Crisis Intervention Training. The course was a revelation for me. From the introduction of CPI's crisis development model, the behavioral model that begins the training, through the post-vention strategies at its conclusion, I knew that the content in nonviolent crisis intervention training was revolutionizing the way I would approach, interpret, and react to challenging behavior in the future. I remember thinking that the special education, healthcare, and human service professionals who took the course along with me were feeling the same sense of enlightenment. I was taken by their thoughtful questions and the way they related CPI concepts and techniques to the behavioral challenges that they experienced back on the job. Through their engagement, it was evident that the course material was deeply utilitarian and immediately relevant. I could feel their excitement about and embrace of the material as the training progressed, and I felt a rush of appreciation for how the lives of the people they taught, treated, and worked beside would be positively impacted. After the training, we began producing monthly episodes of Unrestrained. And some of the best components of these full-length interviews are the real-life stories of de-escalation recounted by our interview subjects. After more than a year of podcast production, I wondered how we could get at more of these real-life scenarios. Taking a cue from the success of storytelling programs such as NPR's StoryCorps and the Moth Radio Hour, CPI decided to launch the storytelling series De-Escalation Tales in the company's Yammer instructor community platform. The 5 de-escalation tales that follow are representative of the series and illustrate how different aspects of CPI training can help provide safer, least restrictive environments and optimal outcomes for individuals exhibiting challenging or crisis behavior. I hope you enjoy them. Thank you. You're listening to De-Escalation Tales, where certified instructors share their experiences working through challenging situations.
My name is Maddie Raisdana, and I am an administrator for intermediate care facility and work with Pathfinder Incorporated. And my story is about a young lady with a bipolar who was basically traveling down the slope of her depressive stage and had been promised to go on a home visit with her mother. But she got into some problem and trouble, and her mother basically canceled the visit. And she got pretty upset because of the cancellation and had grabbed a large knife and was in her bedroom yelling, screaming, saying things like, she lied to me, how can she do this to me, and she hates me, things like that. And she was threatening to kill herself with the knife. At this point, she was pretty much at the release stage of the verbal escalation continuum. And within a short period of time, it became obvious to me that she was kind of coming down from that adrenaline peak of her rage. And, her face was red, her lips had dried up, and her saliva had turned into like a fine foam. And she wasn't yelling as loud as she was. So, my thinking was that she's dehydrated, she's tired, she's out of energy. So I basically told her, you can do that later. I'm going to go get some ice cream. Do you want some? And she kind of looked confused for several seconds and just dropped the knife on the bed and followed me to the kitchen, where we just kind of sat down and talked about her situation over ice cream. In CPI physical intervention, when somebody grabs you, there are some physical and psychological advantages that you can use to get out of that grab. And this person, she had when somebody grabs you, you also use this psychological advantage by using the element of surprise. And she basically had this mental grab on this situation and obsessing and wanting to kill herself. And I had to use that element of surprise to break her concentration. And it did work this time. But, majority of time, it is the person response to the intervention that will make it successful or not. So that was my story.
Welcome to De-Escalation Tales. Our story today comes from Victoria Kim, certified instructor and social worker at Gages Lake School in the Special Education District of Lake County, Illinois. Victoria shares a story about how a supportive stance, patience, and redirection combine to accomplish a successful intervention.
Hi, my name is Victoria Kim. I'm a school social worker at Gages Lake School. I've been a CPI instructor for the past 5 years. I would like to tell you about Becca. Becca is an aide within our program, within our organization. I currently work for the Special Education District of Lake County. So we service a whole range of special needs students. So the class that she worked in particular was a class for students with autism. So in our school, we had that class, and then we also had class for students with severe behavior and emotional needs. So in the morning when the students come off the bus, they come in through this sort of a cul-de-sac. And, as the buses come through, the kids can walk toward the school, or there's kind of two lanes of bus traffic coming in. So we had a student that came off the bus, one of the students with autism, and it's fairly severe autism. And when he got off the bus, he was very escalated. He came off flapping, and he began to run toward the two lines of traffic moving. And, he's a small student. I didn't know if they could see him around the buses. I was able to put out my arms to kind of maneuver him away from that area, and he kind of settled into a grassy spot in between the buses and the school, threw down his bag, was pacing, was flapping, rocking, really showing, a lot of anxiety, but also a lot of concern about, is there risk behavior there as well? So Becca, his aide, approached him, and the first thing she did is she stopped about 6 feet away from him and smiled at him and said, "Good morning." And she just waited for him. And when he didn't respond, she put up she has this note card that has pictures of directions on it. And, she held up one that said walk. And she held it up, and she put out her hand, and she waited. And she waited probably a good minute before the student came in, which was perfect because, there are processing issues, and in particular when he's upset, there are even more significant processing issues. And he walked in the building. He took her hand. He walked in gently. And it really, I think, was a beautiful intervention on many levels. Initially, the student got off the bus demonstrating some significant risk behavior. We could have done a restraint at that time as he's running out into traffic. There's, of course, a lot of concerns with that. We don't want to put our hands on students if we don't need to. There's risk of harm to him, harm to us, but there's also all of these students getting off the bus. So you have 150 students getting off the bus at that time. You have the bus drivers, you have parents. It's not a good situation in general. Plus, if that behavior escalates from there, it's not necessarily the best, most safest place to be. So, I loved that we were able to kind of hold up our arms and direct him without touching him into an area where he was safer. And although he was still escalated, he wasn't moving from the area. He was staying stationary, really showing some signs of anxiety. And she started with supportive, "Good morning." And then, she moved into her into her directive with her card. And he responded. Each time he kind of came down a little, and I liked that she just did that very naturally. And I was so impressed with it, I wrote a letter to her supervisor, to put in her staff file. It was just a brilliant intervention that she just did naturally.
Welcome to De-Escalation Tales. Our story today comes from James Gulbranson, a security supervisor and NCI and PTP certified instructor with Minnesota's CentraCare Health System. James shares a story that illustrates the importance of a team leader, team utilization, appropriate verbal escalation response, and the use of the least restrictive physical intervention as a last resort in successfully de-escalating an agitated patient.
Hello, my name is James Gulbranson. I'm a security supervisor and NCI and PTP instructor with CentraCare Health. I think the story I'm going to talk about today kind of shows how any incident, a variety of the NCI concepts can and should be utilized. Example I'm going to talk about touches on some of the key concepts like utilizing your team, importance of a team leader, appropriate verbal escalation response, and using the least restrictive physical intervention as a last resort. My de-escalation tale takes place at one of our critical access hospitals. This incident occurred on a medical surgical inpatient unit with a patient that had been there for about 4 days. This patient was in his early 70s and had medical needs as well as geriatric psych needs. Since his arrival on the unit, his risk behavior had increased daily, primarily due to him not always knowing where he was and trying to leave his room or go into other patients' rooms. Early on, he'd been placed on a one-to-one due to this behavior and also him being a fall risk if he walked on his own. Something we initiated early to help manage this, the desire to leave his room in the building. With the assistance of staff, he was allowed to leave his room and walk a few laps around the unit whenever he asked. Again, we tried to find some good way to respond to potentially challenging behavior, trying to find some of his triggers and try to find a safe outlet for them. On this day in question, I was called to the main desk of this medical surgical unit and arrived and found the patient and his one-to-one. I was standing in the common area. The patient was pretty upset. He wanted to leave the building. Myself and the one-to-one staff had a pretty good rapport with him since we had worked with him quite a bit. After we spoke to him and he remembered he was in the hospital, he requested just to be able to walk around a little bit with the staff member. So I stood by on the unit while staff did this walk around with him. I wanted to make sure he would return and behavior didn't escalate. After a short time, I was flagged down to go around the corner where they had walked to assist. Upon my arrival around the corner, I found this patient standing near a window, yelling and swinging his cane. Past the staff member, the one-to-one, kind of used her, positioning to be behind him, holding his belt up to kind of keep him standing, but also being in a safe place. The patient was threatening to smash out the window he was next to try to escape. He was also threatening to strike any staff member who got near him. I slowly approached him, waited till he was kind of looking away, and I took hold of his cane above and below where he was holding it and stabilized it. Shortly thereafter, an RN and a social worker who was actually working with this patient arrived to assist. I directed the RN to close some of the adjacent patient rooms and clear some other people out of the area, and asked the social worker to grab a wheelchair for this individual since he was standing and was a fall risk. We got the wheelchair, we got the patient seated in the wheelchair, and he continued to shout and threaten us with his cane. I continued just to hold and stabilize the cane, giving him verbal directions. Again, at this point, really utilizing that idea of relaxing and downplaying the situation. I probably held onto the cane for about a minute before he eventually decided to let go of it on his own. At that point, the patient was pretty upset with myself and the one-to-one. We didn't have a good rapport with him. So the social worker kind of stepped into that team leader role and started talking with them, planning their care plan, kind of letting them know what was going to happen next, and ended up eventually getting the patient calmed down. We got him back to his room from down the hall without any further issue or injury to the patient or to staff. Again, I think just thinking about this story itself, you can kind of see how important some of those concepts are of utilizing a team, getting other people involved, especially with that team leader, finding a good person who has good rapport with the person that's acting out or in that risk behavior, because that really went a long way in de-escalating this. The other part I think was important was really utilizing the least restrictive physical intervention, because we did have a patient who was doing some relatively high-risk behavior, a fall risk. He had a weapon. He was threatening staff. He was threatening to damage property. He was threatening to do some things that could hurt himself. But at the same time, utilizing the least amount of force necessary. When he was seated in the wheelchair and I had a hold of his cane, while he was yelling and screaming and trying to hurt us, he really couldn't follow through on any of that as long as I held onto the cane. So there was really no need to do anything additionally by twisting the cane or trying to pry his fingers or do anything else. We could just calmly wait there until we got him calm and he could let go on his own, limiting the force we really needed to use. So that's my de-escalation tale.
Our latest de-escalation tale comes from Albertus Krall, the Executive Director of Ontario's Little House Residential Care Services, an organization that provides a home for children who can't live with their families. In this de-escalation tale, Albertus tells the story of how he reassured a 9-year-old boy whose fearful, anxious body language told a very different story than his words. As Albert says, the words are one thing, but what are they really telling us?
Hello, I am Albertus Krall of Little House Residential Care Services in Ontario, Canada. And I am the Executive Director. I have worked with children, and before I became the Executive Director, I was a house parent, and we had 6 children in our home. I always have been interested and pay a lot of attention to the underlying messages that people say and that also children say when they talk to us and when they communicate. One day, because many times we have referrals, and we got a child. He was about 9 years old, and he came to our organization. The routine is that we talk with them, and they have the intake, and then we set up a session with a counselor to get a better read on the needs that he has. So after 2 days, I got in the car with him, and I drove him to the counselor, which is about a 40-minute drive. And while driving, he was sitting beside me in the front seat, the passenger seat, and suddenly he said, Dad, and we are parents, and children sometimes at their own speed, they call us Mom and Dad or call us by the first name, but he adapted to that very quickly. And he said, Dad? I said, yeah. He said, the lady likes me. I said, yeah. And I was quiet for a moment, and he said, I'm going to like the lady too. I said, yeah, sure. And I was quiet, and he looked besides me, and he was wringing his hands, eyes big. He said, she will be a very nice lady. I said, yes, she is. And I was thinking, I thought, there's something more to this story. What is he really telling me? So I tell him, I said, you know where you're going? He said, yeah, to the lady. I said, you remember we talked about it. You go to counseling. A lady talks with you about it, and you talk to her about how you feel and a lot of other things. I said, and you know what? I said, I be there. And he looked at me. I said, you're going to come back home with me. He said, I do? I said, sure you do. He said, what did you think? He said, lady is going to take me. I said, no. I said, we're going to go back to Mom. I said, we're going to have supper. And his face changed, and he had a smile on his face. And the story of this is that what he told me was that he had about 8-9 different placements within a year and a half. So what they did, for whatever reason, and I'm not qualifying the reason whether they are good or bad, but they didn't inform him. So a social worker came, and they took him out of the home, and then they placed him in another home. So with that, he thought that I would do the same thing, and that brought on a lot of anxiety to the point that when we were driving, his hands were so wet, they were dripping from sweat. And I'm not kidding. He was one of the children where his anxiety was so great. So what we did, I reassured him over and over again. And even when he was home, when we had to go somewhere, we would tell him where he would go, and we would then say, but you're going to come back home. And it took quite a while before that anxiety really was reduced, and eventually he knew that he would come back. So I am an advocate of listening to the underlying factors, for they are extremely important. The words are one thing, but what are they really telling us? And when we know that, then we can be proactive. We can deal with that and just bypass the words. So for anybody who listens and who is interested in that, and you take the course, CPI is great on that. Every aspect of CPI is very important. Thank you for listening. My pleasure to tell the story.
Our latest de-escalation tale comes from D.C. Foster, a behavioral health specialist at the Arizona State Hospital. In this de-escalation tale, D.C. describes 2 men pacing in the psych unit and cursing angrily to unseen others, one in the day room and one in the patient dorm area. The 2 areas are connected by a single doorway. Listen to the story to learn what happens when the 2 men accidentally meet at the doorway, which D.C. describes as an imperfect nexus leading to a perfect storm.
My name is D.C. Foster. I'm here at the Arizona State Hospital. I'm the behavioral health intervention specialist here in Phoenix. I want to tell you a story about 2 patients who were walking and talking aloud by themselves, possibly directing their talk to what appeared to be an unseen individual or unseen others. They were in different ends of the units. One was in the patient dorm area, hallway. The other was in the day room. Our day room is connected, or the 2 areas are connected by a doorway. As one was pacing the day room, he was overheard verbalizing and saying, and yelling and shouting obscenities and swear words and stuff, directed at nobody in particular. That was kind of a normal behavior for him. The other individual was down at the end of the hallway in the dorm area, and he was yelling and screaming and also yelling obscenities directed at nobody. One of the reasons that staff didn't interfere with this, we gave them an opportunity to vent by putting them in 2 different areas, and we thought they were non-dangerous and they weren't demonstrating any dangerous behaviors or any acting out behaviors. This was normal for them, so there was no intervention. However, a little bit later, they met at the doorway, which is the only opening, and that bridges the 2 areas. It was kind of an imperfect nexus leading to a perfect storm. At that point, their eyes met while continuing to talk and yell obscenities. And just like a scene out of the movie Taxi with Robert De Niro, Taxi Driver, they started talking to one another and saying, you talking to me? You talking to me? You talking to me? You talking to me? That only fueled their rage, and they started to close ranks and began hurriedly walking towards one another for an eventual conflict. Staff intervened and redirected each of them at that particular point. One of the reasons that staff did not intervene is because the behavior was normal and they were considered no threat at that particular time, being in 2 different areas and allowed to vent. But these kinds of things can occur. In the debriefing, one of the things we asked or we touched upon was their ability to distract the patients. Even if they're talking to themselves or unseen others, staff can intervene and say, do you need some help? Is there something I can do for you? And then if they focus on the staff, you got them out of that moment where they're dysregulated and talking to themselves. That could have been a technique that we could have used. However, it wasn't done at that particular time. So the debriefing, we took that and we put it in their nursing care plans to interrupt that behavior. We find that to be more palatable, let's say, than putting hands on an individual. They were fine after that. They also took some PRN medication and stuff, and then they continued to walk and pace, and we allowed that to continue and to go on. There was no further problem with either of these individuals, just an opportunity we missed to distract them. And that was talked about and, again, placed in the progress charts.
Thank you for joining us today on Unrestrained. Tune in again soon for another interview with an expert in behavior management. Until then, this is your host, Terry Vittone, hoping your intention is prevention.